Welcome back, everybody, to semester 2. We're going to start out this semester talking about ecology. Ecology in the textbook is chapters 3, 4, and 5, but in the video notes it's going to be section 10 or unit 10. The reason because is I moved some things around and we merged chapters together and stuff like that. So just go straight to 10. Don't worry about 8 and 9. Okay, we finished up with 7, so just ignore 8 and 9. So, Unit 10, Ecology. Let's take a look at what ecology is. Ecology is the study of the interactions between organisms and the environment. So we take a look at how animals interact with each other, like predator-prey relationships. We look at how plants and animals interact with each other, like mutualistic relationships between pollinators and flowers. We also look at how the plants and animals live in their home, such as how do they deal with living in the hot, dry environment of a desert. So it's a big subject because it pretty much studies every aspect of the environment. So it's a pretty wide area. Now in ecology, we kind of separate the living things, or we separate it into smaller chunks. Now the biggest chunk out of all of them is this thing called the biosphere. Now the biosphere means bio, life, sphere, round. So it's the portion of the earth where you can find all the living things. So as high as the highest thing can grow on a mountain or fly over a mountain, down to the bottom part of the ocean where we find the deepest things living in Mariana's Trench, everything in between there is where we find living structures, and that would be considered the biosphere. It's kind of like if I were to take a look at an orange, the orange being the earth, the peel of the orange would be the biosphere, and when I peel it, everything underneath would be like the rock and the magma underneath where nothing can live. So the biosphere, as you can see, is a very big area. And if you were an ecologist, you wouldn't study that whole entire thing because, your whole entire life you would never finish. So what we do is we break it up into smaller chunks to make it a little bit easier to study. The next smaller chunk is this thing called a biome. And a biome is just a group of ecosystems that have the same climate and the same type of communities. For example, the desert is a biome. The rainforest is a biome, and there's lots of different ones that we find. We live in a biome which is called the Mediterranean climate or Mediterranean biome, where we have hot, dry summers and not too cold of wet winters, and the winter doesn't last very long, and all the things that we're used to. The weird weather here in California is due to this particular biome. And there's about 12 biomes or so that are present in the world. So that, again, would be rather difficult to study. You can spend your whole life studying a rainforest and everything within it, and again, it would take you pretty much your whole life. So we can break it down into something a little bit smaller called an ecosystem. And an ecosystem is all the living and non-living parts of the environment that are all found in one particular area at one time. So if we're talking about, say, a desert, the ecosystem would be the animals, so like the peccaries and the rattlesnakes and the kangaroo rats, and the non-living parts such as the sand and the lack of water and the heat. So putting the two together gives you an ecosystem. Now the deserts, there's lots of different deserts around the world, so we're not focusing on just one type of desert but all of them, so that's kind of a lot too. So I can narrow it down a little bit farther into something called a community. A community is just taking a look at all the living things. So I'm looking at just the animals in the desert. I don't care about the temperature. I don't care about the amount of sand that's present. I just want to look at the living things. So a community is just all the living parts of the organism that are all found in one particular area at a particular time. So collections of populations. So what's a population? Well, that's the next smaller unit. So if the community is the rabbits and the coyotes and the saguaro cactus, well, a population would just be one group of those, members of the same species living together in a particular area. So maybe I'm just looking at just the kangaroo rats and ignoring everything else. That would be a population. Now I can break that down even smaller to the actual species, which is a group of organisms of the same type that can breed and produce fertile offspring. So like a donkey and a horse and I always get this backwards. A horse and a donkey are two different species, but they can get together and make a mule, which is an infertile, can't make babies, offspring. So those guys are two separate species because their babies cannot make babies. So like lions and tigers, I can make a liger, but their babies can't make babies. So that makes them two different species, not the same species. So ecologists usually go somewhere in here and they pick one of these they like and just stick with that and study it. All right, so when they study these things, and if I look at ecology as a whole, I have to take into account that energy has to flow through the system, and energy always comes from one particular place, which is the sun. And we talked about that when we were learning about plants and photosynthesis, that no matter what, all energy comes from the sun. So it is the main source of energy for all life on Earth. And if you use that energy directly to make your own food, well, then we're going to call you an autotroph. So you remember that word, autotrophs. We also refer to you as a producer. So because you produce your own food, and like we said, the produce section of the grocery store is where you find all the autotrophs or the producers. And they do this through the process of photosynthesis. So we're experts at that, so we don't need to go into too much detail. But if you remember, it uses the energy from sunlight to turn CO2 and water into sugar, glucose, and oxygen. So you probably should remember that formula from way back when. Okay, now, not all autotrophs use photosynthesis. There are some organisms that are found way deep down at the bottom of the ocean that use a process called chemosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis, photo means light. Chemo means chemicals. So these guys use their chemical energy that's around them to provide the energy needed to make their carbohydrates, to make their foods. So down at the bottom of the ocean, there are these things called hydrothermal vents. You can kind of see one right here, and there's smoke, what looks like smoke popping up, but it's superheated water. And around these vents, underneath the earth, there's super hot magma, and it's heating up water to where it comes squirting out of here at like 3,000 degrees. It's ridiculously hot. But somehow these bacteria can live in and around here, and it doesn't bother them at all. And in the water, there's things like hydrogen sulfide, which is what makes rotten eggs smell stinky. And they use this molecule to fuel their processes. So plants use sunlight to fuel the process. They use these types of molecules to fuel their process, and they create food. That food then becomes the equivalent of plants for other animals. This food can feed these guys right here, which are called tube worms. These are they're kind of like this. They live in these little seashells of tubes, and their little feathery parts stick out, and they grab food out of there. Excuse me, the lights went out again. Come on, lights, turn back on. Whee! I've determined I only got 5 minutes before the lights always come back on or go off. And then we also have these little crayfish-like animals. There's none in this picture, but the crayfish-like animals, they eat the little bacteria floating in the water as well. So there's two ways that we can make producers, either through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. Either way, the product is the same. It's used to make food. All right, so when you eat food or make your own food, you are considered, let me try that again. If you eat food, not produce your food, you're considered a heterotroph or a consumer. So autotrophs are plants, heterotrophs are not plants. Producers are plants, consumers are not plants. So heterotrophs, us, we need to eat our food either with a mouth, or we need to absorb our food directly through the skin of the organism, like a mushroom. So there's three main categories that we talk about with the eaters. So we have carnivores, carne meaning meat, so these are guys that eat other animals. Omnivores, omni meaning everything, so they eat animals and plants. And then we have herbivores, which eat plant materials. Now there are a couple other, not quite in this category. They are heterotrophs because they don't make their own food, but they don't eat their food in the conventional sense. We have these things called detritivores. A detritivore eats something called detritus. Detritus is dead stuff and animal guts. So whenever there's roadkill on the road, well, detritivore is probably going to be the one who's out there, scraping it up. So these are things like vultures and possums and raccoons, although raccoons can eat live stuff too. And then we have decomposers, and what they do is they break down organic matter. So if you think of like leaves, if you were to have a pile of leaves in the corner of your yard and just leave them, eventually they would just kind of crumble and become one with the dirt again. Well, it's not because of time, it's because of these things like bacteria and fungi. Excuse me. Bacteria and fungi that break down organic matter and turn it back into its principal components of carbon, hydrogen, maybe oxygen and nitrogen as well. Remember chonies? Yeah, see, there it is again. So they break all this stuff down and put it back into the soil so the autotrophs can suck it back up and start all over again. Okay, so we talked a little bit about food chains. It was how this energy gets passed on from autotrophs to heterotrophs. So a food chain is just a single file line of who eats who. So the energy from the sun goes into the plant, which goes into the grasshopper, which goes into the frog, which goes into the snake, which goes into the hawk. So that's a food chain. It just only shows one feeding relationship. And what we see is as the energy from one gets passed on to another, we lose a lot of the energy. And so we have this thing called the 10% rule. Only 10% of the energy gets passed on to the next level. So if he's 100%, well, he's going to be 10%. But 100% of his energy, only 10% will go on. 100% of his energy, only 10% will go on, and so on. And so this hawk is only going to get about, this much use out of the snake. All the rest of the snake is going to be probably excreted or used to help keep him warm. So if we look at the sun as being 100%, then what we can see is the plant gets 10% of the sun's energy, the cricket gets 1% of the sun's energy, the frog gets 0.1% of the sun's energy, all the way down to 0.001% of the sun's energy. So the hawk doesn't get a whole lot of energy directly from the sun, so that's why he's got to eat lots of food to make up for that. Okay. Now, a food web, we like these because it shows how the animals have options. They don't have to eat just one thing. Because if one thing disappears from the food chain, well, then the chain falls apart. So this shows us how we start with producers down at the bottom, and we can show all the choices, all the possibilities that things can eat along the way. So if this owl, who eats birds and mice, if the mouse disappeared, well, no big deal. He'll say, well, I'll just eat the bird instead. And what if the or the caterpillar disappears? No biggie, I'll eat the grasshopper or the ladybug instead. So if you have more possibilities, more arrows going into you, you're more likely to survive than something that only has one arrow going into you because you have more choices. So where you belong in this food web is called your trophic level. So that word troph has to do with food or eating. So like autotroph, heterotroph. So a trophic level is where you belong in the food web. So if this, my producers, is the beginning, then if I'm one away from the plant, that means that I am in the first trophic level. Okay? If I'm two away from the plant, then I am in the second trophic level. But what you'll notice is that you can actually be more than one level. So like this bird right here, he can be, if I follow this one, 1, 2, 3. He's in the third trophic level if he eats the ladybug. But if he eats the grasshopper, he's in the second trophic level. So you can belong to more than one trophic level. Okay, so the owl up here, he'd be in the third and fourth trophic levels. We also use 1, we call that a primary consumer. 2, secondary. The little dot up there means secondary. Tertiary, quaternary. We use words like that to describe where you are in the food web. Now, food webs are a great way to represent who eats who, but there's these things called ecological pyramids that represent visually how much of the stuff that are present at each of the different trophic levels. So in a pyramid, a food pyramid, shows the amounts of energy or matter that each trophic level contains. So we have an energy pyramid, which will show what percent is present in each level. So the bottom one, where the plants are, well, that's going to be 100%. And if we follow the 10% rule, the next level will be 10%. This one will be 1%. and this one will be 0.1%. So we call that an energy pyramid because we're using percents of energy to represent how much is available at each trophic level. We have a biomass pyramid, just shows how many kilograms of stuff. So like say I have 100 kilograms of grass, will support 10 kilograms of grasshopper, will support 1 kilogram of mole, and will only support 1 kilogram of bird. We'll say the bird weighed 1 kilogram. Well, that means I need 1,000 kilograms of grass in order to support that bird. We also have a numbers pyramid, which just shows you how many. So there's like 1 owl here, 2 shrews there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 grasshoppers there, and say 100 blades of grass here. So a numbers pyramid just shows you how many of each thing can be found at each level. Okay, so those are pyramids. Hang on. Okay, so that's where we're going to end it today. We'll pick up probably tomorrow with continuing with the intro into ecology. So thank you guys much, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye.